The jungle beneath them stretched for miles, an endless carpet of trees and vines. John Harris, an experienced wildlife photographer, had always dreamed of exploring the Amazon, capturing its hidden secrets. But as the helicopter descended toward the dense forests below, he had no idea that his journey into the heart of the world's largest rainforest would soon turn into a desperate fight for survival. The weather had been erratic that morning, but the flight was supposed to be routine. A quick trip to photograph rare wildlife in one of the most remote parts of the Amazon, nothing too out of the ordinary. The helicopter pilot, an experienced local named Felipe, had assured him the flight would be smooth. But as the craft descended lower, the engine began to sputter, a strange, rattling sound reverberating throughout the cabin. John's stomach lurched. Felipe cursed under his breath as the craft jerked violently. The world outside the window blurred into a chaos of green as they plummeted toward the ground. The trees loomed like towering giants, ready to swallow them whole. With a sickening thud, the helicopter crashed into the jungle floor. The world went dark. John awoke with a start, his head throbbing in pain. He gasped for air, his chest tight, and blinked several times to clear the fog from his vision. The acrid smell of burning fuel filled the air. Dazed and disoriented, he struggled to make sense of what had happened. The remnants of the helicopter were scattered around him, mangled metal, shattered glass, and the smell of gasoline. He tried to move, but his body was heavy, pinned by debris. Panic surged through him. Was Felipe still alive? His mind raced, but he couldn't focus. The crash had rattled him to the core, and the jungle around him seemed to pulse with an eerie quiet, broken only by the distant calls of unseen creatures. "Felipe?" John croaked, his voice weak. No answer. He tugged at the wreckage, finally freeing himself with a grunt of effort. His legs screamed in protest, but he ignored the pain, dragging himself out of the wreckage. John's first instinct was to find Felipe. The pilot had to be somewhere. But when he staggered through the wreckage, he saw the grim reality. Felipe lay motionless, his body twisted in an unnatural position. It was clear that there was no saving him. A wave of dread washed over John as the gravity of the situation sank in. Alone. In the middle of the Amazon rainforest. With no way of knowing whether anyone was looking for him. The thick jungle surrounded him, dense trees, tangled vines, and the suffocating humidity pressing in from all sides. He checked his bag, only to realize the most essential items, his camera equipment, had been destroyed in the crash. His phone, which might have been his lifeline, had shattered beyond repair. His watch read 9:35 a.m., the last time he would see the real world in a way he had once taken for granted. The thought of waiting for rescue was futile. With the remote location and the depth of the jungle, he knew no one would be able to find him unless he moved. Taking a deep breath, John wiped the sweat from his brow. Survival mode kicked in. John moved as quickly as he could through the jungle, using the faintest trails in the underbrush. The heat was unbearable, the air thick with moisture and the scent of decay. He didn't know which way to go. There was no GPS signal, no visible landmarks. Only the unyielding green of the rainforest. The jungle was alive, teeming with creatures, but at that moment, it felt like a predator, silent, ominous, and merciless. The world around him was a dizzying blur of unfamiliar sounds. The calls of monkeys echoed through the trees, the rustling of leaves signaling the presence of creatures he couldn't see. But there was no time to be afraid. Every minute that passed was a minute he could be lost forever. For hours, John stumbled through the jungle, his body drenched in sweat, his leg beginning to throb with pain. He had no choice but to push forward. The sun began its slow descent, casting the jungle in a muted orange light. Night was approaching. As darkness began to settle over the forest, John realized he needed to find shelter. The Amazon was known for its predators, jaguars, snakes, and insects that could kill without warning. He searched frantically, stumbling across a small hollow beneath the roots of a massive tree. It wasn't much, but it was something. He curled into the small space, trying to steady his breathing. His mind raced, replaying the crash over and over. But it was no use. He was alone in the jungle, and survival was the only thing that mattered now. The jungle night was filled with strange sounds, chirping insects, the low growls of unseen animals, and the occasional splash of water from a distant river. The humid air clung to his skin as he lay awake, staring up at the canopy of leaves above. There was no moon tonight, only the distant glow of fireflies. He was far from civilization, and yet the jungle seemed to press in on him from every side, suffocating him with its thick, overwhelming presence. He had no food, no water, and no clear idea of where to go. But John was a survivor. He wasn't going to die here, not today. As he lay in the dark, he swore to himself that he would find a way out of this. The Amazon was vast, but it wasn't invincible. And neither was he. Tomorrow, he would have to fight. Fight for his life, and for the chance to see the world beyond this nightmare. The jungle may have claimed his helicopter and his pilot, but it wouldn't claim him. He wasn't ready to give up. Not yet. The following morning, the relentless Amazonian heat greeted John like a slap in the face. The night's unease faded with the first light, but the real challenges of surviving here had only just begun. His stomach gnawed at him in hunger, and his throat was dry, desperate for water. But the jungle didn't give, not without a fight. John's eyes scanned his surroundings, taking in the vastness of the wilderness. His legs still ached from the crash, and his muscles felt as if they had been stretched to their limit. Every step he took through the thick underbrush was a reminder of just how far removed he was from the comforts of civilization. The lush, vibrant jungle was both breathtaking and terrifying, a place of beauty that concealed an unforgiving danger. But John had no choice. He couldn't afford to be paralyzed by fear. His body, weak and battered, was telling him to stop, but his mind was relentless, pushing him forward. He needed food, water, shelter, and he needed them fast. His first priority was water. He had to find it. The dry, cracked feeling in his mouth reminded him of the desperation building in his chest. He knew that if he didn't find hydration soon, his body would give up before the jungle did. The sounds of the jungle were no longer a comforting backdrop but a constant reminder of how much he was at the mercy of this unforgiving land. The birds, monkeys, and insects, at first a cacophony of life, now felt like constant alarms, marking every minute he was out there without help. After what seemed like an eternity of walking, John stumbled across a small, meandering stream, its water clear and inviting. He wasted no time, dropping to his knees and scooping up handfuls of water, drinking deeply. The cool liquid was the most satisfying thing he'd ever tasted, a small victory in the face of everything that had gone wrong. But as he drank, his thoughts spiraled back to the crash. The sudden terror. The helplessness. His mind flashed back to Felipe, the pilot who had been his guide and companion for years. The man was gone. He couldn't afford to let that loss take root, but grief and survival had a way of fighting for attention. John shoved those thoughts down, telling himself he had to keep moving. There was no time for mourning in the jungle. After drinking his fill, John surveyed his surroundings. The dense foliage made it nearly impossible to see more than a few feet ahead. The stream wound its way deeper into the jungle, disappearing into the thicket. He had no compass, no way of knowing if this water would lead him to safety or to more trouble. But he had to move. There was no other option. The trek through the jungle was brutal. His leg, already stiff from the crash, protested with every step, but John kept pushing forward. His clothes were soaked through with sweat, his skin covered in bruises and scratches from the sharp branches and thorny vines. The insects, relentless and uninvited, swarmed around him, biting and stinging, adding to the endless discomfort. He tried to ignore them, but it was impossible to escape. As the day wore on, John's body began to feel the weight of the jungle. The heat was suffocating, and his energy was rapidly draining. He had only a small amount of food left, some emergency rations from his backpack, but it wouldn't last long. Every moment spent walking through the dense forest made him feel more isolated. The world outside of this was a distant memory, a faraway dream that seemed increasingly unreachable. By the time the sun began to set, casting the jungle in long shadows, John had no choice but to find shelter for the night. He was exhausted, his body weak and hungry, but the jungle didn't care. It demanded your respect, or it took what it wanted. The insects were even more aggressive as dusk fell, and the air turned colder. John found a narrow cave beneath a large rock overhang. It wasn't much, but it would provide some protection from the elements. He huddled into the small space, trying to rest, but sleep was evasive. The sounds of the jungle, the constant chattering of the monkeys, the rustling of animals in the trees, kept him on edge. His thoughts drifted to Felipe again. What if there was another way out? What if there was a rescue team out there looking for them? He had to believe there was hope. His survival depended on hope. But reality kept creeping in. He was alone in the Amazon, with no way of contacting the outside world, no way of knowing how far he was from civilization. The night was long, filled with the constant, nagging feeling of vulnerability. The fear that something, or someone, might be lurking in the shadows made it nearly impossible to relax. His body ached, but sleep was elusive. As he lay there in the darkness, his thoughts became his greatest enemy. The next day would be more of the same, more searching, more struggling. But John Harris wasn't ready to give up yet. He couldn't. There was still a chance, no matter how slim, to escape. And he would keep fighting, step by painful step, until the jungle either killed him or released him. The next morning, the jungle greeted John with an unrelenting sense of oppression. The stifling humidity clung to his skin, his clothes soaked through with sweat, and his body's fatigue was beginning to show. His stomach rumbled, the hunger gnawing at him constantly. But it was the relentless thirst that had begun to drain him the most. His mind wandered back to the small stream he had found the day before. It had been his lifeline, but he couldn't afford to drink it all again, not yet. He needed to conserve every drop. John decided to move further along the jungle, searching for anything that could help him, more water, more food, maybe even a way out. He had no real sense of direction, no map, and no plan, but he had one thing the jungle couldn't take away: determination. The thick vegetation slowed his progress. Every step felt like an eternity. His legs ached, his body protested against the constant strain. As he hacked through the brush, a thought flashed across his mind: if he could just find a higher vantage point, maybe a hill or a tree with a clear view of the surrounding area, he could get a sense of where he was. But the jungle offered no easy answers. He stumbled upon a narrow clearing, a small patch of dry ground surrounded by dense trees. It was quiet here, unnervingly quiet. The usual sounds of the jungle were muted, as though it, too, was holding its breath. John moved cautiously, surveying the space before venturing deeper. And then he saw it. A dark shape moving silently through the underbrush, just out of sight. John's heart skipped a beat, his breath catching in his throat. The jungle was full of life, but not all of it was friendly. His mind raced as he remembered the stories of jaguars lurking in the shadows, waiting for the right moment to strike. Could this be one of them? His body tensed, preparing to bolt, but he forced himself to stay still. He had to think clearly. There was no way he could outrun a jaguar. It would be faster, stronger, and much more suited to the terrain. He knew the best course of action would be to stay quiet, to try and avoid drawing attention. John pressed his back against a tree, his hand instinctively reaching for anything that could be used as a weapon, a branch, a rock, anything. But the jungle was silent again. The creature, whatever it was, had vanished into the undergrowth. His pulse pounded in his ears as he waited, frozen. The fear was suffocating, yet the most pressing concern was that the jungle was testing him, pushing him to his limits. After what felt like an eternity, John let out a breath and continued on his path, taking every step with caution. The memory of that lurking presence stayed with him, a constant shadow haunting the edges of his consciousness. Hours passed, and the oppressive jungle began to take its toll. His food supplies were almost gone, and he had no choice but to rely on his instincts to find something to eat. He knew he couldn't survive much longer without sustenance. The physical hunger he felt was now matched by a knowing, existential fear. What if this was it? What if he was never found? Just as his thoughts spiraled into hopelessness, he saw something, a small cluster of fruit hanging from a nearby tree. His heart skipped a beat. He approached cautiously, his stomach twisting in anticipation. He reached out and carefully plucked one of the fruits, examining it. It looked like a type of wild mango, a fruit he had seen in survival documentaries. There was no guarantee it was safe, but at that point, his options were running thin. John took a cautious bite. The flesh was sweet, refreshing. For the first time in what felt like days, he could feel his energy returning. He devoured the fruit, then moved on to find more. It wasn't much, but it was enough. For now, at least. The next challenge came as dusk approached. Nightfall in the Amazon was a different world. The temperature dropped, but the humidity remained unbearable. The jungle, which had seemed almost suffocating during the day, now took on an even darker, more threatening feel. The once familiar sounds of the forest had transformed into the eerie calls of unseen predators. John needed to find shelter again. He couldn't risk another night exposed to the elements and creatures that roamed the jungle after dark. He pressed on, searching for a suitable place to rest, but the forest had its own rules, and it wasn't keen on letting him find respite. After a long search, John found a large, fallen tree that had created a hollowed-out space beneath it. It wasn't perfect, but it would have to do. He gathered some leaves and vines, creating a makeshift bed that, although far from comfortable, would at least provide some protection against the cold and the insects. As he lay there, staring up at the dense canopy above, John realized just how isolated he was. The jungle stretched endlessly in all directions, a labyrinth of green that could either lead him to salvation or swallow him whole. The fear of being lost forever crept into his mind, but he couldn't afford to let it take root. Survival required focus. John closed his eyes, not for sleep, but to prepare himself for the challenges that lay ahead. Each day was another battle against the elements, and he had to fight with everything he had left. The jungle might have taken his helicopter, it might have taken Felipe, but it would not take him. Not yet. The morning light brought little comfort. The dense canopy overhead blocked most of the sun, leaving the jungle floor in perpetual twilight. The air felt damp and heavy as John began his march through the jungle once more. His body ached from exhaustion, his muscles stiff and sore from the brutal walk, but there was no time for rest. He had to move. He had to survive. The fruit he had found the day before had given him enough energy to keep going, but now he was facing his biggest challenge yet, finding a way out of this nightmare. John pressed on, walking with a purpose. The thick foliage scratched at his arms and legs, leaving small cuts that stung in the humid air. The undergrowth made it impossible to keep a steady pace, and every step felt like a battle against the jungle itself. The constant buzz of insects, the screeches of monkeys, and the rustling of unseen creatures kept him on edge. There was no escaping the reality that this was a land that wanted him gone. The jungle was unforgiving, and it would not relent until it had consumed him completely. As he moved through the dense jungle, he became hyper-aware of his surroundings. His senses were heightened from the constant fear and danger. Every rustle in the leaves made him freeze. Every movement in the shadows sent a surge of adrenaline through his veins. He had learned to trust his instincts. When the jungle spoke, you listened. Then it happened. John heard a soft sound in the distance, something familiar. The sound of water. His heart raced as he forced his body to move faster, his legs protesting with every step. He wasn't sure how much longer he could continue, but the sound of running water gave him hope. It was something he had been searching for since the day of the crash. If he could find a river or stream large enough, it could lead him to civilization. His pace quickened as he followed the sound, pushing through the thick foliage, brushing past vines and branches. His stomach churned with hunger, but he ignored it. His need for water was more urgent. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, he broke through the dense jungle and emerged into a clearing. His eyes widened as he saw it, an enormous river, its water flowing with impressive speed, cutting through the heart of the jungle like a lifeline. John didn't hesitate. He rushed toward the river, practically falling to his knees when he reached the bank. The water was fast-moving and cold, but it was a welcome sight after days of thirst. He cupped his hands and drank deeply, the cool liquid rushing down his throat like a balm to his parched body. For a brief moment, he allowed himself to close his eyes and simply savor the feeling of replenishment. But as he drank, the reality of his situation hit him again. The river could be a means of escape, but it could also be a trap. The powerful current could sweep him away if he wasn't careful. He would have to navigate it carefully, ensuring that he didn't get too close to the water's edge. After quenching his thirst, John sat by the riverbank, catching his breath. He couldn't let his guard down yet. There was still the danger of predators lurking in the shadows, waiting for a moment of weakness. As he rested, he began to formulate a plan. He needed to follow the river downstream, hoping it would lead him to a settlement or a town. He gathered what little was left of his supplies, ensuring that he had the essentials: a small knife, a few scraps of food, and some water. He took one last look at the river before setting off in its direction, knowing that this would either lead him to salvation or deeper into the heart of the Amazon. The day passed in a haze of fatigue and determination. John walked along the riverbank, his legs aching, his body tired, but he couldn't afford to stop. He kept reminding himself that every step was one step closer to safety. By late afternoon, he came across something unexpected: signs of human life. Broken branches, footprints in the mud, and a faint trail leading into the jungle. It wasn't much, but it was enough to ignite a spark of hope. He wasn't entirely alone in this vast wilderness. With renewed energy, John decided to follow the trail. His heart raced as he moved cautiously through the jungle, aware of every sound and movement around him. Could it be that someone had been here recently? Or was it a trap, a decoy set by predators, or something worse? The trail led him deeper into the jungle, the shadows growing longer as the sun dipped lower on the horizon. Just as he was beginning to doubt, he saw something that almost made him stop in his tracks: a small structure ahead. A hut? A cabin? His mind spun with the possibilities. This could be the chance he had been waiting for. John approached the structure with caution, his heart pounding in his chest. It was small, no more than a simple shelter built with wood and palm fronds, tucked away in a small clearing. The faint smell of smoke lingered in the air, but there were no signs of life. Could it be abandoned? Or was someone waiting inside? He didn't have time to second-guess. He approached the hut carefully, calling out softly to see if anyone was inside. No answer. He pushed the door open, his hand trembling. As he stepped inside, his eyes took in the sparse interior: a makeshift shelter, basic and functional, but it had clearly been abandoned for some time. There were signs of fire, some old food wrappers, and a few scattered personal belongings. But no people. John's heart sank. The hope he had built up in that brief moment of discovery crashed as quickly as it had arrived. This shelter had been deserted. It was a reminder of how brutal the jungle could be to those who weren't prepared. He wasn't the first to be lost in these woods, and if he wasn't careful, he wouldn't be the last. With a deep breath, John gathered what he could from the shelter. He needed to keep moving. He wasn't going to let this setback defeat him. He left the hut, taking one final glance at the structure as he stepped back into the jungle. The river was still his best chance of escape. He needed to follow its path, hoping it would lead him to civilization or someone who could help. As he continued on, the sounds of the jungle began to fade into the background. His focus was now entirely on survival, on staying alive long enough to make it out. The jungle wasn't done with him yet, but John wasn't ready to give up.